Good evening and welcome back to another Swordmaster Publications presentation. I'm Ernie Lawrence. Tonight we're going to be studying Deuteronomy chapter 5. It's a relatively short chapter, and it goes over those representative commandments that are what we call the 10 Commandments that God gave to Moses during those 40 days up in what they're calling Mount Horeb now, but we know as Mount Sinai from Exodus. Just showing you a little bit of the time that's passed because of the change of names here. But it's just a reminder, and there's a few things in here to draw out as we go in and we look at what Moses is reminding them to keep here. So hope you'll stay with me. Hope you'll get something out of this as we dig a little bit deeper into these first 5 books that so many people struggle with. Because I don't think they have a purpose when they study them. I think they just read them to read them, but they really need to find a purpose or a reason to be going through them. And that could be different every time you go through these books, by the way. That doesn't have to be the same purpose every time. So anyway, let's get started with Deuteronomy chapter 5 and verse 1. And Moses called all Israel and said unto them, Hear, O Israel, the statutes and judgments which I speak in your ears this day, that you may learn them and keep and do them. So again, there's that faithful obedience there. In this case, it's obedience to the law of Moses, which is going to be contrasted in books like the book of Romans with the law of faith, or the law of Christ, which is the new covenant. A lot of people get those things confused as to the type that we're talking about. Both of those are laws. You can't sin if there's no law, because sin is transgression of the law, 1 John 3:4. But they'll read Paul talking about keeping the law, and he says the law over and over again. Well, contextually, he's always referring to the law of Moses. He just doesn't say of Moses every time. So the Israelites were required to keep the law of Moses. In fact, they were required to keep all of the law. Jesus is the only one we know of that kept it perfectly. But he did show that it could be done. But we are to keep the law of Christ, and we're supposed to keep it perfectly. But thankfully, when we don't, Jesus has given his life that we can have forgiveness when we do fail. So anyway, just a comparison there. There is a direct comparison there in terms of the need for faithful obedience. It's just which law are you under at any given time. So it says, Jehovah our God made a covenant with us in Horeb. Again, Horeb is Sinai. Jehovah made not this covenant with our fathers. And that word father there is not referencing the previous generation that died in the wilderness. This is talking about their fathers, specifically Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, even the 12 sons who were the patriarchs, and so forth. It goes all the way back to those people saying that he didn't make the covenant there. And Paul brings this out again in Romans, talking about the faithfulness of Abraham and the righteousness of Abraham that was before and outside of the law of Moses. So Moses is kind of making that same point, but we're seeing the other side of it. He's saying God didn't make this covenant with those beforehand. Now understand something. The covenant that he's talking about is going to include things like the Sabbath day. So all of the things that he's going to remind them of, remember, this was not a covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so a lot of people who are saying that the Sabbath day, because of Genesis, is something that is for everybody, it's beyond the law of Moses, everybody should be keeping the Sabbath day. That's not what the Bible says. The Bible is very clear that this was a covenant for Israel, the nation, and it was not part of the covenant, or this covenant was not part of what God had as an agreement with their forefathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and those people. So they don't have any ground to stand on. The Sabbath was a very specific law to the law of Moses. It's not one that was kept under the patriarchal law. It's not brought into the New Testament. In fact, we're going to see a little bit more of that specified here in this chapter. So Jehovah made not this covenant with our fathers, but with us, even us, who are all of us here alive this day. So he made it with the Israelites that had come out of Egypt. But specifically, Moses is saying he made it with you, those of you who are alive today. This covenant is for you, for when you go into the land that he had promised them. So it's very interesting that he's kind of in a way excluding those who died in the wilderness. They died because of their sins, and they didn't get to partake in the promised land. They didn't get to partake into the blessings of this covenant because of their faithlessness. And so that's an interesting distinction that's made here by Moses. So it says in verse 4, Jehovah talked with you face to face. Now remember, all these guys were children at this time. But he talked with you face to face in the mount out of the midst of the fire. Now, did God actually talk to all of these people directly? No, he talked to them through Moses, and he makes that point here in the next verse. He says, I stood between you and Jehovah, I stood between Jehovah and you at that time to show you the word of Jehovah, for you were afraid by reason of the fire and went not up into the mount. Okay? So Moses says, God did talk to you, but he talked to you through me, because you would not have been able to handle the fire. In fact, remember Moses told him, don't come and touch the mountain because you will die. And so he went up into the mountain, was there for 40 days. And anyway, Jehovah talked to them, and he talked face to face. And that's specifically Moses being representative of them. That you got to understand this idea of representation here. Moses represented the children of Israel, and Jehovah talked with him face to face in that literal fashion, but symbolically to the rest of Israel through Moses. So this idea of representation is very, very important to understand. And so Jehovah says, I am Jehovah your God, which brought you out of the land of Egypt from the house of bondage. And we've talked about that, how being in Egypt and being enslaved represented those who were in bondage to sin, and how that through the waters, with the Red Sea on either side and the cloud overhead, they were quote unquote baptized into the sea. Paul talks about this in 1 Corinthians, I believe it is in chapter 10, and how they came up on the other side free. And that was signifying what happens to us during water immersion, that we are in bondage to sin. We obey from the heart that pattern, that form of doctrine, the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. When we go down into the water, our old man is destroyed, and we come up a new creation in Christ, being freed from sin. Romans chapter 6. It's super clear. You can't misunderstand it unless you intend to do so. So anyway, he says, I brought you out of the land of Egypt. You shall have no other gods before me. And remember, a lot of this law ties into the coming out of Egypt. What did the coming out of Egypt do? God sent 10 plagues that represented his challenge to the Egyptian gods to show that they were fake, false gods, sticks and stones and no power. And so he says, because I was able to do that, no other god could do what I did. You will have no other gods before me. And that doesn't mean that they can worship God as like the primary god and then have some little gods that they don't worship as much. It means have no other gods at all. There is no room at all for them to worship anyone but Jehovah God. And it's because he is a jealous God. No other god can do anything, period, much less do the things that Jehovah God is, because he's the only living God there is. So he says, you shall not make any graven image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the waters beneath the earth. Now, waters beneath the earth, we're talking land is here, and then sea is below that in terms of depth and everything. So it's not talking about waters underneath the continents or anything like that. It's just a figure of speech here, saying that the oceans are below the land level. So a lot of people will try to nitpick those little details there and try to say, well, they say that there's water beneath the earth, and there's not any oceans or any life in the waters below, and that's not what this is saying. It says, you shall not bow down yourself to serve him, or unto them, nor serve them, for I, Jehovah, your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children unto the third and fourth generation of them that hate me. So understand this. This is tied to the false, fake gods. Number one. All right, so understand the context of this. This is tied to the false, fake gods. And those that worship these, there's consequences that come that are going to reverberate for generations to come. And it says he's going to visit the iniquity of the fathers upon the children unto the third and fourth generation. Whose iniquity is it? It's the iniquity of the fathers. It's not the iniquity of their children. But the consequences of that iniquity is what's going to hit all the way down to their grandchildren and their great-grandchildren of them that hate me. So worshiping another god means you hate Jehovah. He's just very clear about that. But a lot of people will come to this verse and they'll say, see, look, sin is hereditary. But that's not what this verse says at all. There's nothing about the guilt of the sin being passed on. It's the consequences, the visiting of the iniquity of the fathers. In other words, the father's sin is what's gonna impact these next few generations. Okay, but look what he says. But he's going to show mercy unto the thousands of them that love me and keep my commandments. So if you have a man who sins by going after a false god, he worships an idol or whatever, and of course that's going to influence his children. But out of his children, let's say he has a son that rejects his father's worship, and he does not give in to that false fake god, but instead he loves Jehovah and keeps Jehovah's commandments. Well, God's going to show him mercy, and it's going to break that chain of consequences where he might have siblings that decide to go after the false fake god like their father did, and then they are responsible for their own sin. It doesn't mean that they're guilty of their father's sin. It doesn't mean that they have their father's nature passed on to them by some supernatural or even genetic means. It just means that they were influenced by their father, and what he did, they train up a child in the way he should go, and if he trains them up to worship false fake gods, and they don't choose to come out of that, then they're going to be just as lost. But there's nothing in this passage, nothing at all, that demands the conclusion that sin or some kind of sin nature is a hereditary thing, and it's just not there, and it can be broken, as verse 10 talks about. Then verse 11 says, you shall not take the name of Jehovah your God in vain, for Jehovah will not hold him guiltless that takes his name in vain. What does it mean to take God's name in vain? Well, go to Matthew 15:9. In vain do they worship me, teaching for doctrines the commandments of men. You can go to places like Ezekiel 13. I brought Ezekiel 13 up here, talking about these prophets. It says, they have seen vanity and lying divinations. Verse 4, O Israel, thy prophets are like the foxes in the desert. They have seen vanity and lying divination, saying, the Lord saith, and the Lord hath not sent them. That word, the Lord, there is still Jehovah. Jehovah has not sent them, and they have made others to hope that they would confirm the word. Have you not seen a vain vision? Have you not spoke a lying divination? Whereas you say, Jehovah says it, albeit I have not spoken. Therefore thus saith Jehovah God, because you have spoken vanity. So what is vanity? It's them saying that God says something that he didn't say. That's teaching for doctrine the commandments of men. That's taking God's name in vain. So anyone today, Matthew 15:9, anyone today who teaches something and says God would be okay with this is taking God's name in vain. And that is one of the commands that's brought forward into the New Testament, and it's condemned. So if you say, if God says sing, and you say God says it's okay to use instruments, and God didn't say that, you're taking God's name in vain. You're teaching for doctrine the commandments of men, and your worship is vain. You say God doesn't condemn, say, like homosexuality or something like that, that God will love everybody. It doesn't matter what you do, just believe God is a loving God. Those are all things that God didn't say. In fact, those are contrary to what God has said. And you are speaking as if God spoke, claiming that he said a thing when he didn't, and your worship is vain. Your service to God is vain. And when God says, baptism doth also now save you, that baptism is what puts you into Christ, that baptism is where your old man dies and you rise up a new creature, that baptism is for the remission of sins, that it washes away your sins, that it sanctifies you and cleanses you. All of these places in the Bible, Acts 2:38, Acts 22:16, Galatians 3:26 and 27, Romans chapter 6, 1 Peter 3:21, Ephesians 5:26, all of these places that talk about what baptism does, and you say, no, baptism doesn't do anything. Baptism doesn't save you. Well, that's you taking God's name in vain. That's what that means, is you have said that God has said something that he did not say. And it makes you a liar, and it makes your worship in vain. That's what this means. And I'm not trying to be spiteful or angry or upset. I'm just trying to preach the truth here and say what the Bible actually says. Don't take God's name in vain. If you take God's name in vain, it's you commanding something as if God commanded it when he didn't. And you're a liar, and you're arrogant for doing it by saying, I know better than God how to worship and serve God. And that's just the way that it is. Verse 12, keep the Sabbath day to sanctify it, as Jehovah your God has commanded you. So we're gonna come to this. He's gonna explain what the Sabbath day is again, and then he's gonna explain why he commanded Israel to keep the Sabbath day. So keep the Sabbath day to sanctify it, as Jehovah your God has commanded you. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of Jehovah your God. In it you shall not do any work, you, nor your son, nor your daughter, nor your manservant, nor your maidservant, nor your ox, nor your ass, nor any of your cattle, nor any stranger that is within your gates, that your manservant and your maidservant may rest. Why? This is the purpose of it, that they may rest as well as you. Everybody needed rest. It was necessary for them to have a cessation of work, to recharge their batteries, essentially, to get a day off. All right? No other law in the world at this time had that. And it was God taking care of them, including their servants, their bondservants. And then he says, and remember that you were a servant in the land of Egypt. So what is this tied to? He's taking care of them, but he's also taking care of their servants and saying, remember, you were a servant in the land of Egypt, and that Jehovah your God brought you out through a mighty hand by a stretched out arm. Therefore, that means that all of this stuff that he has just talked about regarding the Sabbath is because of what he's about to say. Jehovah, your God, commanded you to keep the Sabbath day. He's commanding them to keep the Sabbath day because he brought them out of Egypt when they were servants, when they were bondservants to Egypt. And because he brought them out, therefore, he's commanding them to keep the Sabbath. That's why they've got to do it. He didn't bring us out of Egypt. God did not bring us out of Egypt. We are not the nation of Israel. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were not brought out of Egypt and out of bondage and slavery. And so we do not have this physical day of rest to take this cessation of work, because we had been slaves without rest during our time in Egypt. Remember, they drove them constantly, no rest. They eventually had to get their own straw. And the idea of slave driver comes to mind. But God says, because you were like that in Egypt, I'm giving you a day of rest. And I'm going to include all of your bondservants as well. Nobody's allowed to do any servile work during that time. Doesn't mean they can't cook food and make a meal, but their servile work, their jobs, they were not allowed to do that. And it's all tied in together, and it's specific to Israel. Only to them. It's not carried forward into the New Testament. We don't have a Sabbath rest. Our day, Sunday, first day of the week, is a day of worship, not a day of rest. First day of the week is our day to gather, to assemble, to partake of the Lord's Supper, to commemorate the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. Jesus was risen on the first day of the week. That's why the first day of the week is when we hold our day of worship, our assembly. Not the Saturday, not the Sabbath day. And there's a whole lot of mess that we could get into about that, but that's not what we're doing here right now. So, all right. Verse 16, honor your father and your mother as Jehovah your God commanded you, that your days may be prolonged, and that it may go well with you in the land which Jehovah your God has given you. So honor your father and mother. Why? What are your mother and father supposed to be doing? They're supposed to be teaching you, and they're supposed to be passing on all that they have learned with this direct contact with Jehovah God. As time progresses, God moves, or I guess I should say the people move further and further away from God. So God does not speak as directly and as often with the people as he does with Moses. Moses got 5 full books worth of information and direct contact. 40 years where the presence of God is there in a very visible sense. And then as time progresses, the people rebel and they come back, rebel and come back, rebel and come back, and eventually gets to the point where God just leaves the temple and there's no longer that direct presence there. And it's very, very sad for them, but it's because the people have sinned and separated themselves from God. In reality, God isn't the one that moved. It's the people that moved. They moved away from God to serve after these false fake gods. But if they were to honor their father and their mother, then they would prolong their days in the land. It would protect them. It would insulate them from the error of going after these false fake gods, because their parents would be the ones teaching them to honor and worship Jehovah God. You shall not kill. This obviously has nothing to do with just the average killing in terms of animals. They could kill animals. We know that they could kill animals. It talks about it all through Leviticus. We know that they could kill people in terms of war. We have many examples of those. Some of those fairly hard to accept. And then we know that they can kill people in terms of justice. In fact, there was a revenger of blood who could go after the person if you had a family member that died by the hand of somebody else. That person did not intend to kill them. There was no murder in their heart, no hatred in their heart. The revenger of blood got to them before they got to one of these sanctuary cities. Then it was justice. They could take their life. And all of those forms of killing are acceptable to God. And so we understand that you shall not kill is very specific, and God has highlighted what that means multiple times. He talks about murder. He talks about hatred in your heart. He talks about taking the life unjustly. And the idea is that what determines ultimately what murder is God. In our society today, we can't define murder properly without recourse to God. Now, we can try to define it in terms of society's laws, but we know that they're not consistent because we have abortion. Abortion is murder by the very definition of taking innocent life that God has given us. That when you take a life unjustly out of hatred and malice, then you're murdering somebody. And so society's laws are not consistent with what the actual definition of murder is, but they try to define it or whatever, and it only is consistent when you go back to God's law. Without God, murder eventually loses all meaning. And you'll have people that are going too far one way or too far the other in terms of what's convenient for them to define something as murder. You got hate crimes. You got all of these added definitions and stuff where somebody can be tried for more harshly than what they should. And then you've got people who are getting away with 56 million murders since 1973 of the most innocent life there is, which is our unborn children. So, you should not commit adultery. That's another one that's been brought forward into the New Testament, and people just flat out ignore. Absolutely, even those who claim to be Christians have come up with all kinds of man-made traditions about how to get out of that. Whether they want to talk about annulments or they just want to talk about, well, the law says it's okay, and I have this no contest or irreconcilable differences or whatever. No, God says don't commit adultery. And then in Matthew 19, he says that if you divorce for any other reason besides adultery, you're still committing adultery when you go marry somebody else or sleep with somebody else. And so don't commit adultery. It's straight up clear, and man has made the commands of God of no effect by their tradition, just like the Pharisees did. You shall not steal, pretty self-evident. Don't take what's not yours. In that is the idea of private property. You can't steal if everything is communist, if everything is belongs to the people. There's no such thing as theft. You can't steal if it's nobody's, if it's not owned by anybody in the first place. So steal implies the idea of private ownership, and so you can get into another long discussion there. God says don't steal. Another one brought forward into the New Testament. You should not bear false witness against your neighbor. Don't lie about somebody else. In this, wrapped up in this, bear false witness is gossip. Don't gossip about your neighbor. Don't spread rumors. It's not just, this isn't just a court case where you go and you swear on a Bible or whatever, and then you lie in the courtroom or whatever. Bearing false witness against your neighbor is anytime you talk about your neighbor in a way that is false or damaging to them. So gossip, rumors, all of that is bearing false witness against your neighbor, and it's just as wrong. So, verse 21, neither shall you desire your neighbor's wife, neither shall you covet your neighbor's house, his field, or his manservant, or his maidservant, his ox or his ass, or anything that is your neighbor's. In other words, don't desire to the point of jealousy or covetousness, wanting in an inordinate way. Now, if you say, man, my neighbor's got a really nice house, and I would love to have a house like that, so I'm going to work hard, and I'm going to save up, and I'm going to do all that I need to so I can have a house like that. That's not what this is talking about. That is not covetousness. That is motivation, if anything, is, hey, I'm going to do what he's doing so I can have what he's got. And perfectly fine. But, my neighbor's got a hot wife. I would really like to have her. Saw her bathing on the roof the other night, and you know what? I'm going to try to finagle things so that he's out of the picture and I can have her, like David did. Or, man, I really like my neighbor's vineyard over there, and he's not selling it to me, so I think I'm gonna finagle things, maybe get him killed or whatever, so that I can take that land. These things, this is not just hypothetical. These things actually happened, and we'll read about them when we get into the books of history. But covetousness is basically theft in the heart. You want what they have, the very thing that they have, not just something like it, not just something to aspire to, but actually the thing that they have, and in such a way that it drives you to think about doing other things to have that very thing that's not yours to have, that's not rightfully yours to have. That's what covetousness is. Verse 22, these words Jehovah spake unto all your assembly in the mount out of the midst of the fire, the cloud, and the thick darkness, with a great voice, and he added no more. So I want to cover this here. If all there was 10 commandments, this phrase right here would mean that there's only 10 commandments that they had to keep, nothing else. But we know that there's not just 10 commandments. So the listing of the 10 commandments must be representative. Again, they saw God face to face in the fire, but they didn't see him literally. They saw him representatively through Moses. God spoke to them through Moses. God gave these laws in a representative fashion. That these 10 represent all that God spoke to Moses in those 40 days that he was on the mount. And so saying he added no more would automatically eliminate every other command that's in the Old Testament. Everything in the book of Leviticus, everything about the building of the tabernacle and the sanctifying of the priest, all of those commands would be completely eliminated if the 10 Commandments stopped right there, and he added no more. And he wrote them on 2 tables of stone and delivered them unto me. It had to be that those 10 were representative, because they got a lot more than 10 when Moses came down out of the mount. And it came to pass, when you heard the voice out of the midst of the darkness, for the mountain did burn with fire, that you came near unto me, even all the heads of your tribes and your elders. So remember, they came up to the mountain, but not on the mountain. And you said, Behold, Jehovah our God has showed us his glory and his greatness, and we have heard his voice out of the midst of the fire. We have seen this day that God does talk with man, and he lives. So this is the only God that does that. Think about all of the other fake false gods, sticks and stone gods. Who do those gods allegedly talk to? They only talk to the men in power. They only talk to the clergy. They only talk to the Pharaoh. They only talk to the king. You can go through history. You can talk about the Catholic Church and the Pope and the cardinals and all those guys that are higher up. You can talk about the kings of the Dark Ages and whatever. You can talk about the pharaohs. All of them allege that God talks to them and to them alone, and that's why they should have power. But what does God do when he actually talks to the people? He talks in such a way that they see it. When God talked to the Israelites, he talked through Moses, yes, but he talked in a way that they saw the fire on the mountain. They saw the shining of Moses' face. They saw the miracles that were performed. It was evident to them that God was speaking to them. Then when Jesus came, Jesus didn't go to the kings. He didn't go to the rulers. He went to the people. He spoke to the people. God among us, right? When God speaks, he speaks to the people. He does not speak in this kind of layered, I'm only gonna talk to a select few, and you'll never see any evidence of that, or you'll never see any proof of that. You just have to trust these guys. If anybody is saying, well, I talk to God, and you ask them to prove it, and they say, well, I don't have to prove it, you should trust me because of my position or whatever, immediately that person is a liar, and you should reject them. That's how I feel about the Catholic Pope. The man claims to be the so-called vicar of Christ, the voice of God here on earth, and he claims to speak to God. No proof whatsoever. Nobody has seen any evidence other than the guys that, like Pharaoh's magicians, right? They supported Pharaoh. There was this oligarchy of power that they had going. Pharaoh was a god and talked to the other gods, and the magicians talked to the gods, but none of the people ever actually saw this happening. They just had to trust the men in power. Catholicism is exactly the same way. We just have to trust them. And they make these bold, crazy claims, and it's no different. It's not any different than any other oligarchy ever that has claimed to have God's authority. The king is the king because God wills it. Bull. Bull, bull, bull. There is no truth to that whatsoever. As that any monarchy that claims that is just power hungry, and you should not believe them. And hopefully that's a lesson that it's a lesson that America learned a while back, and I hope it's one that gets passed down from here on out, if history can be preserved. But God speaks to the people directly. He speaks to them in an evident way. He does not speak to them in a hidden way. So anyway, for who is there of all flesh that has heard the voice of the living God? Oh wait, let's see here. Yeah, so verse 24. We have seen this day that God doth talk with man, and he lives. So they knew that God was a living God and a true God. There wasn't any sham about it. There wasn't any oligarchy that was trying to hide God and saying, just trust us. Now, therefore, why should we die? For this great fire will consume us. So they recognize the power of God. If we hear the voice of Jehovah our God anymore, then we shall die. So they're saying, hey, we can only handle so much. For who is there of all flesh that has heard the voice of the living God speaking out of the midst of the fire as we have and lived? So, like, this is a unique event. They had heard their God. No other nation in the world could claim this, because all their gods are fake, false, sticks and stone gods. They weren't real. But they had evidence of their God. He was there, present with them. Pillar of cloud, pillar of fire, the plagues, all of the powerful things that he did to show, I am here among you. What other God does that? None, because they're not real. They're fake. Go thou near and hear all that Jehovah our God shall say, and speak thou unto us all that Jehovah our God shall speak unto you, and we will hear it and do it. So they said, Moses, you go up and be our representative. God seems to like you. You guys are friends. You go talk to him. You'll probably survive. We can't handle it. It's too much power. We feel like we're gonna die if we try to do that. And so Moses did. And Jehovah heard the voice of your words when you spake unto me. And Jehovah said unto me, I have heard the voice of the words of this people, which they have spoken unto thee. They have well said all that they have spoken. So God says they're right. You should come up and talk to me, because if they come near, they're probably going to die. And so they were told, don't come up, don't touch the mountain, you stay down here. Oh, that there were such a heart in them, that they would fear me and keep all my commandments. God's saying, why can't they be like that all the time? They're stubborn, stiff-necked people. There are times where they are recognizing the holiness and the power of God, and then there are times when they don't. And the times that they do, God's like, I wish they would be like that. They would reverence me and keep all of my commandments always, that it might be well with them and with their children forever. Forever. When did their forever end? Their forever ended at the cross. Go say to them, get you into your tents again. But as for you, stand you here by me, and I will speak unto thee all the commandments. So he tells them, go to the tents, go on, I'll talk to God. And so on the mountain, he gives them all the commandments and statutes and judgments, which you shall teach them, that they may do them in the land which I gave them to possess it. So here, again, we come back to this idea that the 10 were representative, but Moses actually got all these commandments. And so now, here we are, 41 years later, and he's repeating everything that he got on the mountain. This isn't new stuff. This is stuff that they've been hearing now for 41 years. Okay, but he's writing it down. And again, we see in 1 Corinthians 10 that this was a type of what we see in the establishment period of the church. Jesus died in AD 33, somewhere around in there. And for 40 years, they received the written word. But until that word was written, they, of course, got it orally. And they had people who were literally, personally, supernaturally indwelt by the Holy Spirit to speak what God gave them to speak, to teach the church as it was growing, as in its infancy, as they were writing these things down in an organic fashion for the next 40 some odd years. And then once Jerusalem was removed by the end of AD 73, early AD 74, 40 years later, that obstacle got removed. The wilderness of persecution was over, and the church was fully established. Now, it doesn't mean that they didn't get a few more writings, just like these guys. These guys get some more writings after Moses. So we got a few more writings. We got all 4 of John's eponymous letters, Gospel account of John, 1st, 2nd, 3rd John. We got the book of Jude, and maybe a couple others, 1 or 2 others. Revelation, of course, was written before that time, and quite a few of the others were written before that time as well. But the parallel here is very, very powerful. But the whole thing here is that Moses goes up and he gets all, not just 10 commandments, but he gets all the commandments. And now he's just writing them down so that they'll remember them after he's gone. Verse 32, you shall observe to do therefore as Jehovah your God has commanded you. You shall not turn aside to the right hand or to the left. We've talked about this before, the idea of adding to or taking away, the conservative versus progressive, the conservative binding too much and the progressive loosing too much and allowing too much. Just do it God's way. Don't try to modify it in any way. Don't try to bind what God hasn't bound, and don't try to loose what God hasn't loosed, and you'll be fine. If you do it God's way, if you follow His pattern, then great. If you don't, you're not doing it the way that God obviously wants us to do it. You shall walk in all the ways which Jehovah your God has commanded you, that you may live. That you may live. If we do it God's way, we live. And that it may be well with you, and that you may prolong your days in the land which you shall possess. So the Israelites, if they would have kept God's commandments, can you imagine what it would have been like for 1,500 years if the Israelites had not strayed, if they had faithfully kept God's commandments for all of that time, that they remained a unified 12 tribes and a beacon of light to the rest of the world before Messiah came into the world? How much better of a witness would they have been? How much better of a blessing would they have been to the rest of the world if they had done that? That they were a stubborn and stiff-necked people, and they ended up murdering the Son of God when He came in. That is Deuteronomy chapter 5. We will hopefully do chapter 6 here fairly soon, the next couple of days. I think Monday's going to be a snow day, so we might not have school that day, in which case I'll try to get a couple of more videos done on that day. If I can get my kids well. They're recovering, so it's not the Rona. It's just a quick bug that they've got. Cade's already on the mend, and the girls are over their fevers and on the mend as well, just a lingering cough a little bit. So anyway, thank you for joining me, and as always, leave comments, questions, and we'll see you guys next time.